Hey everyone, Kevin here with Victory 4x4. In this video, I'll show you how we install our strike rear bumper on your 200 series Land Cruiser or Lexus LX 570. Now the first thing we're going to do while everything is still in place and intact as it was from the factory is lay out our cut line. Then once we have that done, we can go ahead and disassemble this, remove some of the unnecessary pieces as well as anything from behind there before we hang it back on the vehicle and make our cut. So the first mark we're going to make is going to be right here at the front edge of the fascia in the wheel opening. I'm going to put a piece of tape down here so I have something to mark on, just a few inches down. And then taking my tape measure, we're going to measure just perpendicular to this line here, come down and make a mark at 3 inches. Just behind that wheel opening. The next mark we're going to make is going to be straight down from here, right at this point in the fascia, just below the tail light. So again, take a small piece of tape. Just to help you locate this, we're going to be running pretty close to this factory body line that runs along the fascia here. So if you're overlapping that a little bit in each direction, you should be just fine with your tape there. And then measuring down, you can make a mark at 6 7/8. Then the third mark we'll be making will be right here at the very back corner, again below the tail light. So I'll lay down a piece of tape, and then right here we're actually going to use our flexible tape measure, just because there's quite a large contour here in the fascia. So I'll put that up flush with that top edge, lay this down, pushing it tight all the way down so that we get a fairly accurate measurement, and then make this mark at 7 1/4. Then the last mark we need to make is going to be right in here where the fascia kind of meets with the tailgate. Again, measuring straight down from underneath this tail light. I've already put a small piece of tape in here, and then I'm going to make a mark at 6 1/2. This cable does tend to get in your way just a little bit while you're making those marks. Just go ahead and lift the tailgate up a little bit, and that'll let that drop down. And once you have all those laid out, you're going to need to connect those marks, again using another piece of tape to mark your cut line. So for this, the easiest way to get a nice straight line, we're going to recommend having something like the laser level that I have set up here. All I did was set this up not necessarily level to the earth, but straight in line with my first 2 marks. And then you can simply trace that laser line with your tape to mark your cut. Push that nice and tight. Then I'll move my laser back here just a little bit to connect these 2 points and carry that line around the back. Then lastly, inside here, you can move your laser and use that if you want, but you're only running across a 4 or 5 inch long span here, so you should be able to connect these 2 marks nice and straight with just your tape. Now the bottom of that line you just laid out is where you're going to cut this fascia. Before we go and do that, a couple things I like to do. I like to come back and trim off the lower portion of this tape just so I know everything clean down here is what I'm going to be cutting. Makes it a little bit easier to follow this green line. And then I'll also come back and mask the top of this off with some more tape to protect it while we're making our cut. Now, just as a point of reference, this cut line is going to run pretty parallel, however just a little bit lower than the factory body line that runs all the way around the back of this fascia, just to give you something to reference there. And then once you're happy with the way this looks and the way you've got everything laid out and masked off, go ahead and do the same thing over on the other side. Now we can move on to disassembly. So to get started there, I'm going to remove these mud flaps as well as unscrew this corner of the fascia from the vehicle. So here in the wheel opening, you're going to have 2 Phillips head plastic screw style clips. There's 4 T30 Torx fasteners right here, as well as 1 more underneath. And then also underneath, way in this back corner, is one that's a 10mm bolt head. Just note that you'll want to keep at least one of these Torx head screws from each side because you'll use that to reattach this fascia later on. Then just inside, on each side of the tailgate, there's going to be 2 of these plastic clips. These you can simply get behind with a screwdriver, pry that out, and then the whole clip will come free. Next, we'll need to remove this step plate so that we can access a couple fasteners behind here. This is just going to be held in with a bunch of plastic clips, so you just got to get under here with a flat screwdriver or like a panel tool like I have here, and then work your way all the way along this edge, just freeing up these clips as you go. Once you got enough of those out of the way, you should be able to grab a hold of this with your hand and just pull it free. Then, using our 10mm socket, we can get in here and remove the 5 hex head fasteners holding this in place. Next, working underneath the vehicle, on each side of the fascia, you're going to have 3 more 10mm hex head screws to remove right here. As well as 2 more here toward the center, followed by a couple more clips that can be removed with a flat screwdriver. Then grab a 12mm socket and remove the 1 bolt on each side of this metal substructure so that it can drop free. Then again, using your 12mm, you'll have 2 bolts to remove here as well as 1 over here, so that this trailer plug can hang free. Then, using a 17, you can remove the 2 bolts holding the factory toe points in on each side. Next, we're going to remove this spare tire mount. To get started, we're going to remove this mounting bolt. It's coming from the top down, so you need to get back here with a 12mm ratchet wrench. Then, using your 12mm socket on a ratchet, you can get these 2 bolts also running from the top down on each side of the vehicle. Then, with all those fasteners removed, you should be able to work this out from between the frame rails and toss it to the side. With that actual tire mount out of the way, you can get in here and remove all 3 fasteners holding the mounting brackets to the frame. Next, we'll have 2 small brackets here, just held in place with 1 bolt each. That'll be a 10mm socket, and you can pull those out of the way. Then, again, using your 10mm, over here a little closer to the driver's side, you'll want to remove this bracket. And then attached to this bracket is going to be the sensor for your keyless entry. So you'll need to disconnect the clip from the bracket back here, which is kind of already done on mine. And then again, using your 10, remove the nut that holds that sensor to the bracket. That should let the sensor slide off of the bracket, and then you can toss this to the side. Then while you're still here working with this sensor, go ahead and take one of the mounting bolts from that bracket and screw this right back in place here to the bottom of the frame. Then with everything removed underneath, you'll come back up here to this cutout. There's going to be 2 wire harness clips. You're just going to need to disconnect the one on the right. There's just a little finger tab in here that you can press and then pull back. And then once that's free, we can pull this rear fascia. Now at this point, the only thing holding this in is going to be the plastic retainer clips along here. So you just need to start at the front edge and work your way back, freeing those up. Once you've got that done on both sides, this whole thing should slide straight back and off of the vehicle. Then now that the fascia is removed, we can go ahead and remove the plastic trim down here on each side. First, you're going to have to pull out 2 screws. Those are just a 10mm head. And then these are kind of a nut clip that holds that in place. So there's going to be 2 tabs on the inside that need to be pressed in before you can pull this back out. Then we're going to need to remove these sensors on each side so that we don't damage them while we're making our cut. So for that, use the thumb tab here and then pull down to disconnect this wire harness. And then you can just tuck that down behind itself for now, so that it's out of the way. And then using your 10mm socket, you're going to have 3 nuts holding this bracket in place so you can remove that entire sensor. Then just make sure that you save the hardware for this, because these will be reinstalled after you make your cut. So now that we have everything important out of the way behind here, we're going to reinstall the fascia just using those factory clips on the sides, and then we can start our cut. Now the reason we're reinstalling this to the vehicle loosely in order to make this cut is because this all becomes a lot more stable once it's snapped back in place on here. Just do be aware that the body isn't too far behind this when you're making your cut. I think you've got about 1 inch of space or so behind there. So when you're using your cutoff wheel along here, you just want to make sure that you're not going too far through that plastic. So what we're going to do now is we'll grab our cutoff wheel. We're going to follow this long straight portion of our line as far up here as well as around here as we can, as far as we're comfortable with before we get too close to the tailgate and everything. Then we'll pull this back off one final time and just finish those end cuts on the ground. Now, like I had just mentioned, cutoff wheel is what we're going to be using here. I'm just going to follow just below this bottom edge of my tape all the way along, and then we'll come back and clean it up with a grinding disc after we're finished. So I'll go do the same thing over on the other side, and then pull this off one final time to finish those ends. So now I'll simply pull this whole fascia back off. And I can just set it down on the ground or a workbench if you have one handy, and finish up these cuts on each end. Once you get both sides cut, that'll leave you with two pieces that look about like this. So then we'll just grab our sanding disc and come back and clean up this bottom edge, as well as anything that might be just a little bit off to tidy it up to our cut line. Now for this sanding, I'm just using a standard flap wheel sanding disc. That kind of gives a nice finished edge when you run it along this plastic, as long as you're not applying too much pressure. And then any small pieces that may be overhanging, once you're finished, you can come back in here and clean those up, often by hand or worst case with a razor knife. Then once you're happy with the finished edge of your cut, you can set both of these pieces to the side for now until the bumper is hanging loosely on the vehicle. Now that we're finished with our cut, this whole lower portion of this fascia is basically garbage at this point, but we do still need to get this wiring harness as well as these proximity sensors out before you get rid of that. So in order to do that, it's just going to be held in most of the way through here with some zip tie style clips. Those are not going to be reused in our bumper, so you can simply cut those all the way along, using care not to actually cut into this wire loom and damage any of the wiring. And that should allow you to pull this free from the bottom of this bumper. Now once the harness is free from all the clips, you're still going to have to disconnect it from all four sensors. Those just have a little push style tab on each connector that you can press in and then pull the harness connector off of the sensor. Then with the harness out of the way, you're still going to need to save these sensors. Those are simply snapped into the bumper. So with just a little bit of firm pressure from the back, they'll pop through and can be reinstalled into our bumper. Now before your new bumper can go on, you will want to come in here and remove both of these wire harness clips from their mounting bracket. Now they're just going to be held in place with a small tab. I've got a pick that I've inserted through the slot from the back side, which should allow you to simply pull that forward. And you can kind of see here, once I have this out, that's the tab that I was pushing up on with the pick. Next, we can get the bumper prepped to go on the vehicle. Now here, you're just going to be installing the sensors, wire harness, your pod lights, and if you're installing carriers, this is a good time to put these latch brackets on as well, because they're going to be way easier to get to now than when it's up on the vehicle. So if you ordered adventure carriers, this latch bracket's going to come with it. You'll take your 1/4 inch long, 1/4 inch button head, install it through that outside hole with a flange nut on the inside. And that one can just be tightened up. And then to actually mount this to the bumper, you'll have 1/4 inch hex bolts, washers, and flange lock nuts for the inside. You'll want this opening toward the outside of the vehicle. Once we have both of these bolts started, I'm just going to tighten these up just enough that it holds it in place, but it could potentially be tapped around just a little bit with a soft base hammer once the latch and the carrier is in place. And then once you do get that in place, you can set the final position of this and tighten it up. Next, we're going to put our pod lights in either side of the bumper. Now again, this is easier to do now, however these will be accessible later. So just go ahead and get these in, get them kind of snug, and then we can make final adjustments later on. Now these lights are just going to install into the slotted mount plate here behind this back face of the bumper, and then you can tighten those up using the hardware provided by your light manufacturer. Now depending on your light manufacturer, it may be necessary to flip the mounting bracket that they provide to set the height of the light in its mounting hole. Next, we'll be working on these 4 proximity sensors. Now for this, you're going to actually need to remove this outer factory cage. So for that, you're going to want to grab the cage with 2 fingers, apply a little pressure with your thumb to the sensor itself, pushing outward. And then there's going to be 4 tabs in here that can be released with a flat screwdriver, one at a time as you work your way around. Again, trying to maintain pressure to that sensor so that all 4 tabs release. Just kind of continue to work at it until you get that outer cage to come free from the sensor. Once you have it like this, what you're looking to do is install this grommet into the bumper and then the sensor into the grommet to hold it in place. Now with these out, they slide on fairly easily. So just to give you an idea of the finished result, it will look something like that. So to actually get it into the bumper, you'll take just the grommet by itself, place it into the hole, and then take the sensor from the inside and work it into that grommet like we just showed. Once you get that in place, you can simply push it out until it sits flush with this outside edge of the grommet. Now up here on the frame, before your wing brace can go on, you're going to have to remove this black plastic cap on each side. For that, I'm just going to get behind it with a flat screwdriver and pull that out of the way. Now your wing brackets are going to look just like this. There will be a left and a right. So pay attention to this. This is going to be the front edge, and then they'll slide up here over the frame. Now here on the driver's side, you're going to have to push the exhaust over out of the way so that you can work this up onto that frame rail. Then once your bracket's up here on the frame, you'll line up this large hole with the hole that you just removed that plug from, and then install your 5/8 bolt with a washer from the inside out. Followed by another washer and a nylon locking nut. You can just thread that in by hand and leave it loose for now. Now that you have it hanging on that 1 5/8 bolt, you can come in here to the inside of the frame and install 2 of these 8mm flange head bolts back into the factory mounting holes. And again, we'll just leave those loose for now. Now, when you're installing this on your LX570, you're going to encounter this AHC pump that's going to be in the back passenger side rear corner. You're going to need to remove this from the frame, remove this factory mounting bracket, and then you'll be reinstalling one that we provide with the bumper. Now to get this pump off of the frame, you're just going to be using a 12mm wrench or a socket on a ratchet. There's going to be 3 mounting bolts here that hold the bracket, and then 1 up here that holds a bracket connected to one of these hard lines. You'll remove all 4 of those. Then with all that hardware removed, this pump should be able to be picked up and then slid out, kind of freeing that up from the frame. Then you're going to have 3 nuts that hold this bracket to the pump. Those can be removed with a 10mm wrench. Now you won't necessarily have to completely remove these nuts because that's on a slotted mount as well as the replacement bracket. So with all 3 of those loose, simply slide that out of the way. And then your new replacement bracket should slide right back in its place. And you can push that up tight and tighten those nuts back down. Then you can let that hang for just a few moments while you get this rear bumper bracket installed, and that'll mount to the bumper bracket using these 3 bottom holes. Now with this bracket in place, go ahead and grab 3 of the provided clip nuts from your bolt pack, and you'll need to snap those in place over each of these holes to fasten to once this bumper mounting bracket is bolted in. Now we're ready to put the bumper up here on the vehicle. Now to get started, we're going to slide it up where it's just going to be resting on this frame. To do that, you will need to let the bumper on these outside wings hang down so that it can slide on and get the flange here underneath the tailgate, as well as the front edge ahead of these wing braces. Now, one more thing you may not have been able to see as this was going on is this plastic trim piece here. Those you just want to make sure that our bumper sits outside of that plastic on either side of the tailgate. Now, with the bumper up in place, you can start by installing the 2 fine thread 12mm bolts through these bottom slots into the factory threaded frame holes. And I'm going to run these in most of the way just to support this, however not tighten it, so that we can still have just a little bit of adjustment as we finish installing the rest of our hardware. Now here at the front of the wing to the wing brace, you're going to be using these 1/2" button head bolts, and then backing those up with 1/2" flange nuts. There will be one here through the bottom, and then 2 more that'll come from the wheel opening through to the bumper. Then we'll go do the same thing over on the other side. Next, we're going to install these lower tie-in brackets. There's going to be one for each side of the frame. It's going to have 2 holes down here that correlate with the 2 holes in the bumper, and then a single slot here that goes up to the frame. You'll simply slide that in place, install 2 more of those 1/2" button heads with flange nuts down here. And then to go up through the frame, you'll be using a 1/2" by 4" long bolt with a washer. And then up top, you'll place another washer and a nylon locking nut. Next, we'll loosely install this center tie-in. It's going to look like that. Simply slides in place here on the center of the bumper, just behind this hitch. Then from each end, you can slide in a 1/2" flange nut, and then install a 1/2" button head up from the bottom. Now we'll leave this tie-in just like that for now, and we'll come back to it once the bumper's located and all the other hardware's tight. Now that we have all our hardware started, you're going to want to come out here to the ends of these bumper wings. You're going to support the bottom of this using a jack. If you're doing it on the ground, great, use a floor jack. Just bring this up so that it's nice and parallel along here with the edge of this body line. Then we'll grab our 15/16. We'll go underneath here and tighten that 5/8 bolt for the wing support bracket, followed by the 2 8mm using a 13mm socket. Once those are tight, grab a 5/16 hex and tighten the 3 button head bolts out here for the wing to the wing support. Next, with that wing still supported, you can come underneath here and tighten these 2 12mm bolts using your 19mm socket. Then using a 3/4, you can tighten that 4" long 1/2" bolt that we ran up here for this tie-in bracket earlier. Then you can again grab your 5/16 to tighten up your 2 1/2" button heads here. Now with the rest of our hardware tight, we'll come in here to this center tie-in bracket. I've snugged these up just a little to hold it in place. You're going to center it on this hitch from left to right. And then all you're gonna do is in the center of each of these slots, you'll center punch and then drill a 7/16 hole so that you can then run in your 1/2 inch self-threading bolts. Now, if you're concerned about damaging this powder coat, you can pull this back out during the drilling process and then reinstall it as you go to thread in those bolts. Now for these 1/2 inch self-tapping bolts, you're just going to need a 3/4 socket and then likely a 1/2 inch impact to drive these in. For these, I'm just going to get all 4 started and ran most of the way in before tightening everything up. Then once all 4 of those are tight, you can come back and tighten both of these up with your 5/16. Now that we have all the main mounting hardware tight, we need to tie up some of these loose ends with all the things we removed earlier on. So to begin, here with this trailer plug, you're going to need to remove this factory harness mounting bracket here. There's just 2 little tabs on that clip that need to be pinched, and then that can drop out of the way. Then we can reinstall this trailer plug to the factory mounting location here with factory hardware and tighten that up with a 12mm socket. Now, if you're not going to be running one of our tire carriers on the bumper and still want to run a spare back under here, this spare tire mount can go back in using the tabs we provided here, along with 5/16 button heads and flange nuts in your bolt pack. And then this mounting bolt up here will just be a factory 8mm bolt that threads right back in. We're going to be running our tire carrier on the back of this, so I'm going to leave ours out. We'll need to reinstall the sensor wire harness. For that, you just want to route it up here over top of this spare tire mount. And then you'll take the sensor plugs and run them over top of this frame cross member between it and the bumper. And then you can route those out to the respective sensors and do the same thing over here on this other side. Then once you have all 4 of those plugged in, come back here and reconnect the harness to the plug at the frame. Then once you have this plugged back in, you can tie this up to the existing factory wiring harness here. Now, one thing we found when you're installing this sensor wire harness into your LX570 is it's going to be taped here near the main connection into this 4-corner bundle setup, taped on all 4 sides. You're going to need to very carefully remove all that tape and gently cut this piece free, and that's going to leave you enough wire to actually gain slack here, allowing you to pull this out to the far end connection on the driver's side. Now when you open these up, this isn't all going to be nice and neatly taped yet. There will be some just exposed wires in there inside of their normal wire casing, and that's why we went ahead and added some additional tape here to keep that all protected. Now you may or may not need to do this in order for this far connection to reach, so just go ahead and loosely route this up into your bumper first and check to see if you have enough slack between these 2. Now we can come out here and reinstall these blind spot monitors in each of the rear corners. Then just grab your 10mm, you can tighten these up. You'll need to reach in from underneath to tighten that bottom one now, and then you can reconnect the wire harness to that as well. Now at this point, we're ready to reinstall our corner plastics. Now you're gonna see I've left all my tape on here up to this point, and that's kind of for good reason. I'll get this all snapped in as best I can. You can see it's wanting to pop out here just a little bit, and that's because it's actually making contact right here in this back corner. So I need to make some minor modifications to my cut around this back side to let that fit and give us the gap we're looking for along here. So I've kind of got a nice gap, kind of about the size we're looking for up here. I just need to come back and begin blending that in and then bringing it up about 1/4 inch above the bumper all the way around the back here. But now we have our bumper in place to use as a reference and a guide to easily mark that out and trim that extra off. So now that I'm happy, I've made all my final cut adjustments, I've removed my tape, we can snap this in place one final time, making sure that it pops in to all those factory clip locations. And then we'll reinstall one of the Torx head fasteners up here in the wheel opening, followed by the clip back there inside of the tailgate. Now your LX570 is going to differ from the 200 series Land Cruiser also when it comes to this tailgate. Now the biggest difference back here being on the Lexus, they put these reverse lights in the tailgate. Now the lights they put in here stick out pretty far past the back of this tailgate, which is going to potentially cause a clearance issue with this open. Now the way they sit right now, those lights aren't contacting the bumper, but when you put weight on this, whether it be your whole body, gear you're loading and unloading, there is an issue there where it may contact the surface of the bumper and could potentially damage that light. Now since you're already installing a rear bumper with provisions for pod lights that can also be used as reverse lights, we can remove these lights from the tailgate without any real issue. So in order to do that, we're going to provide you with these filler plates that are going to go in place of these lights. Now to get started, we're going to need to remove these rear cargo area covers, as well as anything that you may have in here, like the factory toolkit. Once you have that stuff out of the way, you're going to need a 10mm socket. There's 4 bolts down in here that need to be removed. Now with those 4 bolts out of the way, the only thing holding this plastic in is a bunch of factory clips. So to release those, I'm just going to start out here in the corner, try and get my hand started underneath there, and then just work your way all the way around these edges to free up those clips. As you can see, once you get to a certain point, they all kind of release, and you can get this out of the way as well. Now once we have the inside of this tailgate exposed, we're going to begin by disconnecting the lights from this wiring harness. So to get started there, you're going to want to take this clip and remove it from this factory tab. So I'm going to get my hand behind here and release the first tab, holding that clip in place, and then use this screwdriver to push down from the top, releasing the other tab. And once you have that out like this, there's just a little thumb tab here that you'll need to press and then pull the 2 halves apart. With that disconnected, grab a Phillips bit or Phillips screwdriver, and you're going to have 3 screws here that need to be removed so the light housing can drop out of the tailgate. Just go ahead and guide that wire harness out with the light, and then these can be set aside. Now, as for this leftover harness connection, that can simply be tied back in to the clip hole where it was removed, just like this with a wire tie. And by tying it in back there, we prevent it from getting in the way of anything else that moves or gets mounted back into this tailgate. Now, before you install the light filler, you're going to want to remove any of this foam gasket material that was behind the factory light. Use a plastic scraper if you have to. Now, with as much of that gasket removed as possible, we're also going to recommend that you come in and apply a light bead of RTV sealant all the way around that light perimeter. Now you can take your light filler and carefully place it in that opening. And then you can install 2 of the provided 1/4" button head bolts with nylock nuts on the back side. Then with a 5/32 hex and a 7/16 wrench or socket, you can evenly tighten these up. Now, after you get that tightened up, you'll want to come back and remove any light excess that may have pushed out during that process. And then just double check specifically across this top edge to make sure you got a nice watertight seal. If not, you can always add just a little bit more RTV right back in here and then wipe off any excess. Now with that one finished up, we'll repeat that process over on the other side. Now at this point, you've got both of your fillers installed. You'll just need to go back to the inside and reassemble that inner tailgate. Now at this point, you've also omitted your reverse lights from the tailgate, so we're going to show you where to tie into power to wire those to the LED pods in your bumper. Now the easiest place to access power for these reverse pods down here under the vehicle is going to be at your trailer connection. So for this, grab a small flat screwdriver. There's a couple tabs on here you can push to release the plastic cover at the back of this plug. Allowing that to come free. And then we're going to strip this back a little farther and remove some of this wire loom as well, just to expose enough wire that we can work with it without things being too tight or compact. And then we'll reassemble all this with new tape later on. Now once you have enough of that stripped back and these wires exposed where you can work with them, the nice part is these plugs actually come with a wiring diagram right here on the face. So you'll look at this wiring diagram, you'll find the circuit labeled backup lamp. On these, that's going to be the center connection, which when you come back here is easy to identify as this yellow wire. So that's where we're going to tie in power for our reverse lights. Now to tie into this, there's a couple different ways you could do it. You could strip this wire in 2 different spots, about 3/4 inch apart, and peel back this wire casing if you were going to tie a wire into it and then solder that connection. Or what I'm going to do here, since I have these watertight connectors, I'm simply going to cut this and then we'll strip back both ends. And then on one end, preferably down here at the plug, I'm going to install this heat shrink connector and crimp it in place. Always be sure to pull back on these and just check your crimps, make sure you're good. And then using a small stretch of red wire, I'm going to twist this back in to the other end of that cut yellow power wire. And then we'll insert both of those into the other end of this butt connector and crimp it in place. And then again, be sure to just come back and check those crimps, making sure you got both of those wires secured in there. And then you can double check this wire diagram, and then you'll tie in for the ground side of this circuit to the white wire here on the back of this connector, just like we did for the power side here. Now we can come back and carefully heat shrink each of these connections. Now once you have both those connections secure and everything heat shrinked, you can go ahead and tape this back up, reinstall the loom, and then reinstall this outer plastic cover. Now that we've got this looking pretty much as it did from the factory, with the exception of the 2 additional wires, it's time to actually tie those into your pods. Now this is where things start to vary quite a bit depending on which manufacturer you got your pods from, whether or not you bought a harness to go along with them, and all the variables there. So since our lights came with harnesses, I'm simply going to find the power and ground side of my wire harness circuit here and tie those in to the corresponding power and ground that we just installed here at the trailer connection. Then if your pod lights do have a running light feature like ours do here, so it's a 3-wire circuit, you can actually tie that in just like we did with those last 2 here at the trailer plug to the tail lamp circuit so that those are always on when the lights are on the vehicle. Then once you get all those wires connected, it's just going to be a matter of throwing the vehicle in reverse, checking to see that your lights are working. Then you can tie up any loose wires you may have, throw this trailer connection back into its factory location, and reinstall the bolts. Now at this point, if you're going to be installing our adventure carriers, go ahead and check out the adventure carrier install video. If not, we supply you with these black plastic caps. You can install one both top and bottom of the adventure carrier spindle location. Now we recommend when you're installing these caps that you put a little bead of RTV silicone sealant around the outside, and that way when you put them in, it's just going to prevent any dirt, debris, or moisture from getting in those holes in case you plan to go back and install an adventure carrier later on. Next, you'll be installing 4 of these 5/16 clip nuts here near the center of the bumper. 2 of them are going to go right here on these mounting tabs. The other 2 will have 2 small hole locations here underneath in that center tie-in bracket. These will simply push in place over those holes. Then once you have all 4 of those snapped in place, grab your center hitch cover logo plate. You can slide it right into the cutout and then install the 4 5/16 button heads and tighten those up with a 3/16 hex. And once you get that tight, that'll complete your install. So if you guys have any questions about this installation or any other product we offer here at Victory 4x4, feel free to reach out to us. You can call us at 269-459-8447 or email us at info@victory4x4.com.